I'm delighted to welcome you back to our digital series in equitable recovery. Today's guest is Baroness Camilla Cavendish of Little Italy. The Baroness is a former head of policy at Downing Street for former Prime Minister David Cameron. Today she's an advisor to the present Prime Minister Boris Johnson on essential reforms to the National Health Service in the UK. In between, she's been a journalist for the Financial Times. She's co-founded a public-private partnership that was invested in workforce development in London. And she also helped to start and currently chairs a very large charity that addresses the social care needs of older Londoners. With that, I welcome Baroness Camilla Cavendish of Little Italy.
Hi Gary, thank you for having me.
You're welcome. So we met back in March of this year in New York when you had your US book launch of your wonderful book, Extra Time. My question to you this morning is, why did you write this book?
I realized that what we think of as old is no longer old. And we used to think of people being old at 60, being old at 70. And when I looked at the people around me, I began to realize that they didn't seem old in the way that we used to think of it. And I started going to different parts of the world to explore what old really looks like. And I discovered that actually we're all worried about getting older, but it's not old age that's getting longer, it's middle age. And so I called the book Extra Time because I think that almost without noticing it, we've created this new period in many people's lives between 50 and 75 or even 80 in some cases, where they are hugely energetic and they have a lot to contribute.
And what did you learn from your research and experiences of looking at how different advanced societies address the issues of aging? What did you learn?
So there are two things going on in the world. One is that we're living longer because of many improvements in health and medicine. The other is that the birth rate is falling all over the world. So some countries are actually shrinking. Japan is actually shrinking in terms of its population numbers. And that's accelerating this process towards much, much, much older populations. And what that means is that we're no longer going to be able to rely on a younger generation to support a kind of pyramid, a big younger generation supporting a few older people. The pyramid is reversing. And that means we have to really think very hard about what do our pensions look like? How can we work longer? And even the meaning of family, because actually with fewer people having children, who's going to look after us? So there's a whole lot of big questions that we have to start answering.
And you mentioned pensions being challenged by the sort of aging of our societies. Did you experience any discussions at the policy level as to how are we as advanced economies going to absorb an aging population?
So this is a huge issue for Western governments, which have made pension promises to people that they're now worried they can't keep.
Yes.
And it's also a fundamentally moral issue because there are many people who get into their 60s and are not actually as lucky as the people I've talked about. I mean, there are people with chronic health problems who really do need to be looked after and can't keep working. So there is a huge effort going on in America as well as everywhere else to look at how does the benefit system need to change? Because the danger is, Gary, that if we keep paying pensions to richer people and we start paying them at 60 or 65, those richer people, by the time they die, are going to have amassed far more welfare benefits than anybody ever intended. Whereas poorer people who are going to die younger are not going to get those benefits. So we have to recalibrate our whole pension system.
So are you suggesting that we have some kind of means-tested approach towards these entitlement programs?
There's been a study in the US looking at the federal benefits, and it is extraordinary. I mean, it shows that, as I said, if the rich keep living longer and we don't improve, for example, disability benefits, you're going to have an imbalance. So there's an argument for means testing. There's also an argument for improving some of the other benefits like disability, which can counter that effect.
Yes. Now, you also talked about the individual and the family and how they are addressing this issue of aging. What did you learn from your various research and conversations about how that issue's been addressed? Sort of how does aging affect the individual, and how does it affect the loved ones and the community?
So I've worked in government, as you said in the introduction, but I don't believe government solve most of these problems. I believe that
Yes.
actually family is fundamental. And what we are seeing is the emergence of multi-generational households.
Yes.
Funnily enough, because of student debt, an awful lot of students are moving back home with their parents, and the financial crisis brought a lot of families back together again. So what we thought of as the fragmentation of family is actually coming back together again, sometimes
Yes.
for unfortunate financial reasons. But you're seeing all sorts of extraordinary things like real estate developers offering now 2 homes for the price of one. So, you know, the
Yes.
parents living next door to the kids if they can afford to. And I think that's a good thing. However, it's absolutely true that the family is under strain from the sort of frailty at the other end of the spectrum. So when I went to Japan, I interviewed gerontologists and geriatricians, and they all said to me, we're not really interested in anybody under 75 anymore, because we
Wow.
think of those people as the young old. So compared to 30 years ago, most Japanese people under 75 don't have the same health problems they used to. Over that age, they call them old, and they have the same problems that we have in the West. They have dementia, they have serious frailty, and they do live longer with those things. And that is a burden that families very often are bearing, and it's very often middle-aged women who are caring for their spouses or their parents, and that is a huge burden on women. So we do have to find new ways of supporting those people. But one of the most encouraging things I found in all sorts of different countries is that people are not waiting for governments to fix these problems. They're creating membership organizations, they're creating co-housing developments, they're creating neighborhood networks to look after each other. And quite often that's with a mixture of ages. So here in London, where I'm speaking from now, there's an older women's co-housing cooperative that took 18 years to build because nobody wanted to build it. And it's got women between the ages of 50 and 90 who are all living together with a shared philosophy, and they're looking after each other. And you see that all over the world. There's one in Boston, which is a village, which is a kind of membership organization. And that village, Beacon Hill Village, has spawned 130 other villages across the world. And basically, most of us in the world are in the same boat, which is we want to age well, we want to look after each other, and we don't want to be done to by the state. And so you're getting a very interesting spread of resilience. In Holland, I went to a wonderful care home where university students live in with the old people. The university students, they get their own apartment, they do 30 hours of chores in return for that apartment. And the bonding and the relationships that are being built there are completely fantastic. And that scheme is now oversubscribed because every student wants a place in that old people's care home. And what happens is it's a two-way relationship. So you imagine that the student will be giving everything to the old person. Actually, they're learning so much the other way. And the old people are telling stories about the war. They're teaching skills. They're showing these students how to garden. And it's a very, very enriching relationship. And of course, what we know is that relationships and connectedness are really, really good for your health.
You know, and we discussed this on Monday about my love of cities. And I grew up in a small place called Battersea. You went to school in Putney, so we are from roughly the same part of South London. Um, I love cities. Much of your analysis came from your experiences visiting cities and taking stock of how this issue of aging was being handled within societies, but also being handled by cities. My question is, and you wrote about this summer in an article in the Financial Times, where you said, but how we think about cities may change forever as a result of COVID-19. Can you speak to that a little bit, please?
So I think the era of the megacity is over. I'm a Londoner, as you said. I've kind of been a city person all my life, and I love the fact that the city offers all these facilities and it has a scene. But if there's no scene, because we all have to be at home, the city kind of loses its soul. And I think the move from offices to home working may well be permanent for some people, because a lot of people in the biggest cities in the world have had to commute for so many hours to get to work.
That's right.
That given the chance, it would be crazy for them not to stay home. So I think the city will change shape. I think we will see more people moving to the suburbs. And I think this era of very densely populated, enormous cities will flag a little bit. Now, that's not to say that the great cities of the world won't have brilliant culture and brilliant arts and brilliant entertainment, and the scene will eventually come back once this virus abates.
Yes.
So I don't think it's completely dead. But I do think that a lot of young people have sacrificed a lot to live in very small, cramped apartments in the middle of cities.
Yes.
And actually, there's no scene. And those kids don't want to have to pay enormous rents in the middle of a solar city. We will see a bit of a move away from that, which I regret, but I don't think it's terminal.
I agree, but I'm also concerned about what it means to be poor, right? And you are less mobile. And you have jobs that were dependent on a vibrant city, right? Frontline positions. You walk into any one of London's big Richard, you walk into the building, you'll see African and Caribbean security guards, right? You go upstairs, you see receptionists who are primarily minority and immigrants. The folks who are cleaning the buildings are primarily immigrants from Eastern Europe. And so if you're lower income, you are extremely vulnerable to the kind of analysis that you have so well presented. What happens to them?
And it's not just those people, it's the people in the coffee bars too, because the whole ecology, the whole retail ecology of the city streets is being decimated at the moment.
Yes.
And in fact, in Britain, our government has just told us not to go back to the office. So a month ago, it told us to go back to the office because it was worried about exactly the people you're talking about. Now it's just told us this week not to go back to the office, so we're all confused. The only positive thing is that I think rents will fall. So I think a lot of the people you're talking about have had very long commutes to get to the job as a security guard or get to the coffee bar, and I think they've paid very high rents. So I don't think all of those jobs will disappear, but I think the location of the job will disappear, but it, funnily enough, might move closer to where they actually live, because in the richest cities in the world, in New York and London, you have seen the poor pushed further and further and further out.
Very true.
So the truth is that the poor are not living in the center. It's the rich who are living in the center. And what we're seeing is, if you look back at plagues throughout history, we're seeing the same phenomenon which has happened in the Great Plague and the Spanish flu epidemic. The rich are moving to the countryside, to their nice houses that they already had, and they're decimating the city. But around the suburbs are still really vibrant. And actually, that is where a lot of your demographic that you've just talked about are living. So that is not all bad news.
So you see many cities becoming Paris, right? Where you see a lot of wealth concentrated in the center city. But if you take the metro in the wrong direction and miss a few stops, as I have on a few occasions, you see the real Paris, right? Where the poor are concentrated on the periphery of the city, right? Do you see that as being one of those sort of legacies of what this COVID pandemic has created?
Well, this is fascinating because Paris had an explicit policy of pushing the poor out to what they call the banlieue, the suburbs.
That's right.
Now, London had a completely different policy, which was mixing up the poor and the rich, building social housing and state housing in some of the richest areas and getting a much more blended mix, actually.
Yes.
So the irony of all this is that for some of the people in the suburbs, they're going to be looking at a better life. An awful lot of this is going to be accident. It's going to be where you happened to end up living when the music stopped.
Yes.
And that means that some people are going to be fine and others aren't. And I mean, all of our finance, every government in the world, their treasuries are deciding right now, how on earth are we going to either shore up those jobs or move those people into other jobs and reskill them. So in Britain, just announced yesterday a lifetime skills guarantee, which is a kind of voucher for training, because we know we are going to have so many people, and they are largely on low incomes, and they are largely in the hospitality sector.
Baroness, I'm sorry, who pays for that?
Well, ultimately, the taxpayer will have to pay. Right now, interest rates are very low and we're borrowing the money, but none of these governments are going to be able to sustain that forever. So ultimately, the dear old taxpayer will be paying. But we don't know how or when yet.
Yes. So if I can go back to COVID-19 for a moment, and the US has had three major shocks, right? COVID-19 has revealed the vulnerability of being poor. And in particular, it has accentuated the reality of being poor and minority, right? The pandemic has also created the US economy. Unemployment was 3.5% in February. It was almost 21 by the middle of May. And then we had Black Lives Matter, right, which again brought to our nation's attention our unresolved issues around race and racial tolerance and police brutality. We've had these three major shocks, which I have often argued should have forced a real deep introspection about who we are, what kind of society should we be, and how do we want to live together going forward. Instead, it hasn't forced that introspection. It's forced even greater polarization, right, between those who represent the administration's viewpoint and those who are making significant demands for change. We've had these threats. What we haven't had is a real solution, a real set of discussions around what do we do going forward. What I discovered in my analysis and observations of what happened in the UK was during the COVID-19 pandemic, while Parliament had dispersed, and while your response wasn't exactly perfect, at the very least, there was deep discussions about what kind of society should we be? How do we help the vulnerable? Where do we place these Florence Nightingale hospitals to ensure greater access for everybody who might be afflicted? What lessons, can you tell me, have you learned about COVID-19, in our case, Black Lives Matter, and how that should frame how we think about society, how we think about the individual, but ultimately, how do we think about workforce? Because ultimately, citizenry have to be back have to return to the economy in ways that they could then provide for their families. It's a long-winded observation, but can you share with me your reaction to what I just said?
We may have been more introspective in the UK than certainly the way you're presenting it in the US. And I do think you have a very polarizing president and your politics are very polarized. Now, we in the UK went through Brexit 3 years ago, which was extremely polarizing. But it led us to have some of the conversations in advance of COVID-19, which may have made it easier for us to have the period of reflection that you're talking about, because the Brexit vote, the vote to leave the European Union, was partly an expression from the forgotten people of what they wanted. And what they were saying is globalization and mass immigration has not worked for us. I mean, that's to simplify enormously the issue. But there was a huge sense that people, particularly in low-income groups, were getting a voice that they hadn't had for decades. So that was very powerful, and that led to a series of conversations in Britain about how are we going forward to go forward as a nation. Now then we had COVID-19, and COVID-19 coincided with deep health inequalities, pre-existing health inequalities, which also affect the ethnic minority community, and which I happen to have been writing and worrying about for years, but which were very much hidden. So in the UK, if you live in the northeast of England, for example, you are likely to live 8 years less than if you live in the southeast of England. And
Wow.
they're very similar statistics all across America. That is absolutely shocking. And it is linked in both your country and mine to obesity, and it's linked to chronic disease, which both your country and mine have a problem with that actually, for where I sit, the rest of Europe doesn't really have. We have fed people on fast food, we have pushed them into long commutes, we have made it very, very difficult for people to remain healthy. And one of the worst things that has come out of COVID is that some ethnic minority communities, actually especially the South Asian community here, are particularly vulnerable to this virus. And it's suddenly opened up this concept from being something that has been discussed within small rooms in health and academia, where I've been sitting, into something that's a much wider public conversation. And I think ultimately that will be very powerful, because we now know that we have a whole group of people in our society who are under stress, who are living in poor housing, who are getting poor diets, and their health has suffered as a consequence, and that is making them horrendously vulnerable to this disease, and the statistics show that. A lot of those people also work in our health service, and they work in social care, and they are looking after some of the most needy and vulnerable people in our society.